The mountains do not rush. They have no need to. They rise in slow, patient folds, their backs arched toward the sky, as if stretching after an eternity of stillness. In the pale dawnlight, they appear almost weightless, their jagged silhouettes dissolving into the horizon. Mists move among them, like careful keepers, shrouding their faces from the hurried gaze of the lowlands, and somewhere within this high and ancient labyrinth lies a story the wind has been trying to tell for centuries. It begins not with the clang of battle or the roar of conquest, but with silence. Here, where the air thins and every breath is a negotiation with altitude, once lived a people whose lives were woven into the very rock beneath their feet. Their homes were cradled in terraces carved from impossible slopes. Their fields blossomed where no fields should, coaxed into life by skill and stubborn hope. In the evenings, fires lit the high plateaus, their smoke curling upward, as if sending messages to the stars, and then they were gone. Not destroyed in the way a city is destroyed, not scattered in the way a people are scattered by war, gone in a manner that left no clear trail, only faint impressions in the dust, like footprints in the snow that vanish under the next wind. To stand here now is to stand on the threshold of a riddle. How can a civilization with its own rhythm, its own voice, its own pulse, vanish into the stillness of stone? The mountains, of course, are not quick to answer. They have seen countless ages pass, empires rise and fall, rivers carve new paths, stars burn out in the cold sweep of the night sky. A missing people is nothing new to them, yet for us the absence feels almost unbearable. We cannot help but ask, we cannot help but listen. The first thing you notice when you climb into these highlands is the sound, or rather the spaces between sounds. The wind comes in long deliberate breaths, curling around cliffs and threading through pine forests that cling to the slopes. Somewhere in the distance, a stream falls down a sheer face of stone, its voice soft and steady, like water reading an old poem to itself. Above it all, birds call in notes that echo and fade, leaving only the vast humming quiet. That quiet is where the whispers live. Local shepherds speak of hearing them at night, when the moon is full, and the valleys below are asleep. They say the voices sound neither near nor far, but everywhere at once, words they do not recognize, spoken in a cadence that feels like the rhythm of walking uphill. The old ones tell these tales as if they are not stories at all, but warnings. Not every voice in the mountains is meant to be followed. And yet, to the curious, the temptation is irresistible. Historians, explorers and wanderers have all tried to trace the story of the vanished highland people. Some have come away with fragments, pottery shards baked with intricate spirals, tools fashioned from stone harder than the cliffs they stand upon, woven cloth dyed in colors that match no plant found in the modern range. Others return with nothing at all, as if the mountains chose to keep their secret locked away that season. Perhaps that is the first truth of this place. The mountains decide what is remembered. Still, there are clues. In the valleys below, stories persist, tales of travelers who would descend once a year to trade salt, honey, and obsidian for grain and metal. These traders were said to move with the calm certainty of people who knew their home was unreachable to outsiders. Then one year, they did not come. The paths they once walked were overgrown, within seasons the passes sealed with rockfall and ice, but absence leaves a deeper mark than presence. For centuries after, lowland cultures continued to speak of them in the present tense, as if unwilling to admit they had gone. Festivals still featured songs in a half-remembered language. Offerings were left at the base of mountain trails, meant for hands that would never receive them. It is in these small stubborn acts that we glimpse how deeply the vanished people once mattered. And so we begin our own climb, up the narrow switchbacks where thin air catches in the lungs, past slopes where even the grass seems to cling for dear life. Each step is not just a movement upward, but backward in time. We are walking toward their absence, toward the space they once filled, toward a truth that may dissolve the moment we touch it. This is where our journey begins, in the high cold light of a dawn that feels older than human memory. The mountains stand as they always have, silent, indifferent, eternal. But somewhere in the thin spaces between their stones and their snowfields, the whispers are waiting. They may speak to us, or they may keep their silence forever. The climb grows steeper as the trail thins, winding along ridges where a misstep would send you sliding into a gorge carved by centuries of snowmelt. Your breath turns shallow. Each inhale feels like sipping the air through a straw. The mountain demands patience. It asks for silence, not in words, but in the slow tightening of your chest and the distant throb in your temples. It is in this strained quiet that the traces begin to appear, faint, uncertain, but unmistakable. The first is a single wall, not a ruin, not a house, not even a full structure, just one wall standing in isolation. Moss has grown thick along its base, and alpine flowers spill from cracks in its stones. To most, it would look like nothing, a random alignment of boulders shaped by frost and gravity. But a closer look reveals the truth. Each stone was cut to fit its neighbor with precision. No accident could produce it. A fragment of human intention, in a place where nature rules almost completely. Nearby, the faint remains of a pathway, cut across a slope. Centuries of erosion have softened its edges, but the curve is still there. A deliberate arc carved for feet that once passed in steady rhythm. If you follow it far enough, it disappears into a scree field. Stones scattered by a rock slide, long after the last person walked this way. There is no sign of where it led, no trail on the other side, just the open, indifferent face of the mountain. In the lowlands, there are written accounts, traders' journals, fragments of chronicles, that speak of the last visits these highland people made. They describe small groups descending into the valleys with woven sacks slung across their shoulders. The sacks were filled with salt from distant springs, obsidian shaped into arrowheads, and dark resin that burned with a strange sweet smoke. The men and women who carried them wore layered wool garments and cloaks pinned with hammered copper. Their faces were lined, but their eyes were described as clear and sharp, like the light above the snowline. One account tells of a man who came every summer for 20 years. His name was never recorded, but the chronicler remembered the sound of his voice, low, deliberate, like someone measuring each word for weight before letting it go. He traded fairly, never haggling, and always left before sundown. Then one summer, he did not come. The following year, neither did anyone else. The disappearance was not noticed immediately. Life in the valleys continued. Harvests came and went, rivers rose and fell, kings were crowned and buried. But after a few years, the absence became impossible to ignore. Paths that had been well-worn grew faint. Passes that had been open most summers became blocked by snow, even in the warmer months, as if the mountains themselves were closing a door. Archaeologists, who later came to search for answers, found puzzling scenes, frozen in place. In one half-collapsed structure, they discovered grinding stones, still holding traces of grain. In another, a pot half-filled with dried herbs lay cracked but unscattered, as though it had been set down carefully and never touched again. There were no signs of violence, no charred beams, no scattered bones, no defensive walls breached. Whatever happened here, it came without chaos. Some theorize that the people left in an orderly migration, slipping away in small groups until no one remained. But if they moved elsewhere, they left no trace of their arrival. There are no matching artifacts in neighboring regions, no sudden appearance of their style of pottery, or their particular methods of stonework. It is as though they stepped into a fog, and simply never stepped out again. Others suggest something more sudden, a disease, perhaps, or an environmental collapse. Yet the evidence does not quite match. The terraced fields, though abandoned, show no signs of having been ruined by drought or flood. The structures still stand against the wind and snow, suggesting they were not abandoned because they became uninhabitable. It is this contradiction, the persistence of the land's livability against the reality of its emptiness, that gives the mystery its haunting weight. The last tangible artifacts found in the region seem almost to resist interpretation, a set of carved figures, each no taller than a finger, shaped from a dark green stone, found only in certain hidden valleys. They depict human forms with exaggerated eyes and hands, the fingers splayed wide. Scholars have argued for decades over their meaning. Were they protective talismans, ancestral portraits, or something else entirely? No one can say for certain. There are also the textiles, fragments of cloth dyed in deep blues and reds, that have somehow survived the centuries in dry sheltered alcoves. Their patterns suggest a symbolic language, geometric yet fluid, but there is no key to unlock them. Without the voices of the people themselves, we are left to guess, and in guessing, we are left to create stories. Stories that may have nothing to do with the truth. The mountain wind seems to sense our searching. It moves differently here, funneling through narrow passes in sharp bursts that rattle loose stones and set the heather trembling. In the still moments between gusts, the silence feels deeper, as though it is aware of our intrusion. You find yourself looking over your shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching from a ridge, only to find the slope empty, the line of the peaks unbroken. It is easy in such a place to begin feeling that the past is not entirely gone, that it lingers just out of reach, like a shadow you can sense but not touch. Each artifact, each fragment of a wall or path, feels less like evidence and more like an invitation, but to what? To discover, or to get lost. The last known footsteps of this civilization fade somewhere high above the treeline, where the earth narrows into jagged rock and the air tastes of snow, even in summer. There is no single spot to mark their departure, no stone with their names carved into it. Just the slow, almost imperceptible realization that the trail is no longer a trail, that you have crossed a threshold without knowing it. And perhaps that is why the mystery endures, not because of what was found, but because of what was not. The people who once called these heights home, left behind enough to prove they were real, but not enough to tell us why they left. In that space between certainty and speculation, the imagination roams freely. It fills the void with possibilities, a secret exile, a spiritual calling, a pact with the mountains themselves. Whatever the truth, the last known footsteps echo still, not in the soil or the stone, but in the human need to understand, to find meaning in the shapes left behind, to believe that the people who walked here once can be known again, if only we listen closely enough. The path narrows to a knife-edge ridge, and the world drops away on either side. Far below, valleys unfurl like green rivers, their forests trembling in the wind that sweeps down from the glaciers above. The climb has been long, but the feeling that grows here is not triumph, it is humility. The mountains do not bend to human presence. They simply allow it for a time, and perhaps that is why they have served for millennia as both refuge and tomb. It is an ancient paradox. Mountains draw people in, while holding them apart. To the desperate, they promise safety, a place high above the wars and plagues of the lowlands, beyond the reach of enemy armies. To the devout, they are stairways to the divine, where the sky feels close enough to touch, and the air carries no stain of the world below. But they are also unforgiving. Their winters can last half the year, their slopes yield nothing without relentless labor, their storms can strip a camp to its bones in hours. The vanished people knew this. Every surviving trace of their life here speaks to a deep and careful negotiation with the land. They built terraces into slopes that seemed too steep for anything but rockfall. They channeled snowmelt into narrow irrigation channels, winding like silver threads through fields that would otherwise be barren. Their homes were clustered in sheltered pockets, protected from avalanches by natural rock outcrops. To live here was to move in rhythm with the mountain's moods, never pushing too far, never asking for more than the land could give. And yet, there is a deeper question hidden in their choice of home. Did the mountains protect them, or imprison them? The high passes are few and treacherous, open only during the brief summer window, when the snow retreats to the highest peaks. Even then, a single storm can close them for weeks. In the lowlands, borders shift, roads open, and new ideas flow in with trade caravans. But here, life changes slowly, insulated from the currents of the outside world. Such isolation can preserve a culture's traditions in exquisite detail, or it can suffocate it. Other highland peoples, throughout history, have faced this balance. In the Andes, communities thrived for centuries in valleys threaded between walls of snow and stone, trading rare goods for the staples they could not grow. In the Himalayas, entire kingdoms existed at altitudes where the rest of the world seemed impossibly far away. Each had its own methods of surviving the thin air and scarce resources, but each also faced the same truth: the mountains gave, and the mountains took away. One can imagine the vanished civilization's relationship with the land as a kind of pact. The mountains offered safety against invasion, against overpopulation, against the feverish changes sweeping the lower world. In return, the people accepted the limits the peaks imposed. They moved through their seasons like a slow heartbeat, planting in the brief spring, harvesting before the snows returned, gathering in communal halls when the cold became absolute. Theirs was a life of measured cycles, as predictable as the sun's path across the ridge. But the pact may have had a cost. When disaster came, whether in the form of disease, famine, or something stranger, there would have been no easy escape. The same slopes that kept enemies at bay would have kept the people in. The same snow that shielded them would have sealed them in place. There are stories in neighboring valleys of a winter that did not end, a year when storms buried the high passes in ice that never melted, when flocks died on their feet, and mountain streams froze solid. No one can say exactly when this happened, or whether it was a single winter, or many, but the tone of the tales is always the same: a warning about the fragility of life above the tree line. If such a winter struck this civilization, it could have erased them in months, leaving only the faintest traces for us to find centuries later. And yet, the ruins we see do not look like those left behind by starvation or chaos. The walls stand neatly, the terraces are intact, and there is no sign of hurried abandonment. Whatever happened, it did not leave the marks of panic, which returns us to the other possibility: perhaps they left by choice. If the mountains were sacred to them, and there are signs they may have been, then leaving would not have been a simple migration. It would have been an act heavy with ritual and meaning, perhaps even viewed as a transformation, rather than an end. Some scholars suggest they may have gone inward, retreating to even higher, more remote sanctuaries that remain undiscovered. Others think they could have dispersed into smaller groups, blending into distant highland cultures so completely that their origin was forgotten within a few generations. The question lingers: did the mountains keep their secret, or become their secret? Standing here, looking at the sharp shadows falling across the ridges, it is easy to imagine the mountains as living things, patient, watchful, unwilling to give up what has been entrusted to them. In the way the wind shifts suddenly, in the deep hush that falls between gusts, there is the faint suggestion of choice, as if the land itself decides what will be revealed and what will remain hidden. Perhaps that is why the place feels so alive, even in absence. The ruins are not dead stones, they are teeth in a long-buried jawbone, hints of a voice that might still speak if the right question were asked. The terraces are not empty fields, they are ribs of an old sleeping giant, holding the memory of harvests in their bones. And the passes are not just roads, they are arteries, once pulsing with movement, now closed, carrying nothing but wind and drifting snow. To the modern visitor, these heights feel both impossibly open and impossibly closed. The sky seems limitless, yet every path is hemmed by walls of stone. The horizon is vast, but every step forward is hard-earned. It is a place of freedom within constraint, where the air smells of pine and ice, and the mind swings between awe and unease. This tension, the pull between safety and isolation, between the mountains as guardians and as graves, is at the heart of the mystery. If we can understand how these people lived with that tension, we might inch closer to understanding how they vanished within it. But for now, all we have are traces, scattered like loose stones on a ridge, a wall without a roof, a path that ends in rockfall, a handful of artifacts that speak in a language we no longer understand. And so the climb continues, not just upward, but inward, into the layered silence where the line between history and legend begins to blur. Somewhere ahead lies the heart of their world, the great stone halls that still stand in the cold, waiting for a visitor who will not come. The slope begins to even out, and the path widens into a narrow plateau. Here, the air carries a sharper chill, and the ground feels strangely deliberate beneath your boots, as though it has been shaped subtly by human hands. And then you see them, stone walls rising from the earth like the ribs of some vast buried creature. They are not scattered ruins or random stacks of rock, but deliberate, careful constructions. Terraces cut into the slope descend in neat steps, their edges still crisp despite the centuries. The walls are made of stones fitted so precisely that not even a blade of grass can slip between them. There is no mortar, only the weight of stone upon stone, held together by balance and intent. The first structure you approach is a broad rectangular foundation. Its walls stand waist-high now, their upper stones long since tumbled, but you can still sense the space it once enclosed, a dwelling perhaps, or a storehouse. The floor is covered in a carpet of moss, soft enough to swallow your footsteps. In the far corner, half buried in earth, lies a flat slab of stone, smooth on one side and engraved with faint lines, patterns too weathered to read, like the fading of a voice into memory. Not far away, a larger, more imposing building dominates the slope. Its doorway is framed by two massive upright stones, each carved with grooves that may once have held wooden beams or decorative panels. The entrance faces east, toward the sunrise, and inside, the floor dips slightly, as though this was a gathering place, perhaps a hall where voices rose together in song or ceremony. The acoustics here are remarkable, even a whisper carries, curling back from the stone like a returning breath. Some walls climb so high that they seem impossible for their time. Blocks the size of small boulders are stacked in precise patterns, alternating between broad, flat stones and narrow, upright slabs. Scholars still debate whether such masonry was meant for strength, beauty, or both. And yet, as you trace your fingers along the edges, you cannot help but feel the quiet elegance of it, how every line, every angle, seems to have been decided with care. Above the main terraces, smaller enclosures cling to the cliffside like perches. From here the view opens to the endless sweep of valleys and peaks. It is easy to imagine lookouts posted here, watching for travelers or weather changes, their eyes sweeping the horizon. But the structures are not entirely defensive. Many are positioned to catch the light of the sun at specific times of year. Some align with the horizon, where the sun rises on the solstice, others with the moon's highest point in winter. This blend of practicality and celestial alignment suggests a worldview in which the heavens were as much a part of daily life as the soil underfoot. You wander deeper among these stone shapes, and the sense of absence grows stronger. The buildings are too intact to feel like relics, too well preserved to seem entirely abandoned. It is as though the inhabitants have stepped away for a moment and may return at any time. A row of low circular platforms catches your eye, perhaps the bases of granaries, raised to keep food dry. Near them, a narrow channel of stones runs down the slope, once carrying water from a spring higher in the mountain. The engineering is simple but exact. Water would have flowed here with a steady, controlled rhythm, nourishing the terraces below. What strikes you most is the silence within these structures, not the emptiness of a place forgotten, but a stillness that feels intentional, as if the walls themselves are holding something back. You walk through a narrow passageway between two tall walls, the air cooling noticeably as you enter shadow. Here lichen grows in pale, delicate patterns, tracing the seams between stones. The scent of damp earth rises from the ground, mingling with the faint sweetness of alpine flowers carried in from the terraces outside. The deeper you go, the more the architecture begins to feel like a language, one without words, built instead from space and light. The tallest hallways open suddenly into wide courtyards, their walls framing slices of sky. Small niches carved into stones suggest places for offerings, or perhaps for lamps that once cast flickering light across the walls. The structures guide you as much as shelter you, leading your steps in patterns you do not entirely understand. There is one building higher than the rest, whose walls have remained remarkably intact. Its entrance is narrow, forcing you to turn slightly as you pass inside. The interior is long and rectangular, with a raised platform at one end. From here the view through the doorway perfectly frames a distant peak, its summit capped with snow. Standing on the platform, you feel the room align around you, as though every stone were placed with this perspective in mind. Was this a place of leadership, a temple, or simply a home for someone who valued the sight of that peak above all else? Theories abound. Some archaeologists believe these mountain structures were seasonal, used only in summer when the snows melted, then abandoned for lower settlements in winter. Others suggest they were permanent, sustained by stores of grain and salted meat, with families enduring the cold months together in the warmth of their stone walls. The truth may be somewhere between, or somewhere beyond what we can imagine. What cannot be denied is the craftsmanship. Even after centuries of wind, frost, and shifting earth, the stones hold their shape. The terraces still hold soil, the channels still suggest the path of water. These are not the marks of a people who struggled blindly against the land, they are the marks of a people who understood it intimately, and who built as though they expected their work to last as long as the mountains themselves. And yet the greatest mystery remains: why leave such perfection behind? If these halls were strong enough to endure centuries without repair, what could drive their builders away? Standing in the largest courtyard, you close your eyes. The wind moves between the stones, carrying a low hum, a resonance that seems to come from the mountain itself. It is easy to imagine it as a voice, slow, deep, patient, telling a story you cannot quite understand. The stones are the syllables, the terraces the sentences, the entire settlement, a paragraph in a language older than your own, but the meaning, like the people, has gone beyond the ridges, where their terraces cling to the slopes, beyond the carved channels that once carried meltwater down to the fields, lies a different kind of record, one not measured in artifacts, but in words passed from one mouth to another. Here in the valleys below, the vanished Highlanders are remembered not through dates and chronicles, but through the shimmering lens of legend. They are called by many names in the tongues of the lowlands: the Sky People, the ones above the clouds, the children of the eagle. Each name holds its own shade of reverence, fear, or longing. The most common tale says they were born not of earth, but of the horizon itself, carried to the mountain tops on the wings of giant birds when the world was still young. In these stories, the Sky People were keepers of secrets. They knew the language of the wind and the paths of the stars. They could read the weather by the scent of the air and heal the sick with leaves that grew only where the snow melted for a single week each year. Some versions say they could disappear into mist at will, vanishing before the eyes of strangers who wandered too far into their territory. Others claim they had no need to vanish, for no stranger could find them unless invited. The myths are rarely told plainly. Instead, they appear in fragments, in lullabies, sung to children, in festival dances that mimic the flight of birds, in proverbs so old their literal meaning has been forgotten. One such proverb, still spoken in a valley village, goes, "When the summit hides in cloud, speak only to the one who sees it." The elders cannot agree on what it means, but they say it comes from the Sky People, and so it is repeated, without question. Travelers from centuries past recorded encounters that read like the joining point between history and myth. A wandering monk, seeking solitude in the mountains, claim to have seen a figure standing on a ridge at sunset, dressed in white, unmoving, watching him until the last light faded. When he climbed to the ridge the next day, there were no footprints in the snow. Another story tells of a group of lowland herders who found themselves trapped by an early snowstorm while driving their flocks through a high pass. As the storm closed in, they were certain they would die. But at dawn, the wind stopped, and a narrow, clear path appeared through the snow, lined with pine torches burning low. They followed it to safety, and though they searched for those who had lit the way, they found no tracks, no ash, and no remains of the torches. To the historian, such tales are infuriatingly impossible to verify, but to the listener, especially here, at the edge of the high world, they feel less like inventions and more like echoes, softened by distance and time. Folklore, after all, is not built from nothing. It begins in some truth, no matter how small, and grows in the telling. Some believe these myths were shaped by the Highlanders themselves, perhaps intentionally. A reputation for mystery is its own kind of defense. If outsiders believed the sky people could vanish into cloud or walk unseen through a blizzard, they might be less inclined to attempt the climb. The mountains, already formidable, would seem even more unreachable when guarded by people who were more legend than flesh. Others argue the opposite, that the myths are inventions of the lowlands, born from longing and curiosity. In this view, the Highlanders became a canvas for every dream of freedom and self-sufficiency, every fantasy of living in harmony with the land. The mountains hid their real lives so completely that the imagination had no choice but to fill the gap, and yet certain patterns in the stories feel too consistent to dismiss entirely. In every version, the sky people are tied to the sun and stars. They are said to hold festivals at dawn and midnight, and to measure their seasons not only by the weather, but by the position of certain constellations. Their homes are always described as touching the sky, whether in a literal or symbolic sense. Even the way they are depicted, tall, straight-backed, with cloaks that ripple like wings, feels eerily in tune with the architecture we have already seen, with its high terraces and sweeping views over the horizon. In some stories, there is a warning. A tale of betrayal runs through the folklore like a dark seam in stone. It tells of a season when strangers came to the mountains, not to trade, but to take. They sought something, gold perhaps, or sacred knowledge, and the sky people, rather than surrender, chose to vanish entirely. They walked into the mist, the story says, and the mist never gave them back. In this telling, their disappearance was not loss, but defiance. But in other versions, there is no betrayal, only a slow fading. The people grew fewer with each passing season, their voices softer, their presence lighter, until one year there was no one left. They became the wind itself, the old women say, and now they pass through the valleys only in the rustle of leaves and the sigh of snowmelt streams. The most haunting thing about these myths is how they refuse to settle into one truth. They resist the historian's need for clarity, just as the mountains resist the traveler's need for a direct path. They are many things at once, cautionary tales, dreams of elsewhere, echoes of memory. And so, when you stand on a terrace wall, looking out over the same valleys they once saw, you begin to feel the pull of both worlds, the weight of stone, and the weightlessness of story. Perhaps they are not separate after all. Perhaps the vanished people are as much in the myths as in the ruins, alive in every telling, in every whispered name. The wind rises again, catching at your coat, swirling around you before slipping away up the slope. Somewhere ahead, beyond the last visible terrace, the land folds upward into shadow. It is toward that shadow that the myths seem to point, as though there is something more, something deeper in the mountains that has not yet been found. And so, like those who came before, you follow. There is a point in every story where the thread simply ends. You trace it back as far as you can, following each strand of evidence: stone walls, irrigation channels, fragments of pottery, and then you find yourself holding nothing. The fiber has frayed to air. For the Highland civilization, that point comes somewhere in a span of years, no one can now pinpoint with certainty. Some accounts place it in the late summer of a particular century, when the last trade caravan from the mountains failed to arrive. Others suggest it was earlier, that by the time their absence was noted, they had already been gone for years. The exact moment is swallowed in the haze of history. Yet here, in the stillness of the high passes, you can almost feel it, a moment when the balance tipped, when the pact between people and mountain shifted. The disappearance seems to have left no violence in its wake. Excavations have uncovered no mass graves, no burned structures, no evidence of siege or battle. The terraces are intact. The stone channels still carry water when the snow melts. It is this quiet, almost graceful departure that makes the mystery so unnerving. Civilizations often leave behind scars. This one left behind perfection, as if it had tidied the room before stepping out for the last time. Archaeologists try to read the signs in layers of soil. One dig found the remains of crops in storage pits, still edible when they were abandoned. Another uncovered unbroken pottery, sealed with wax, its contents undisturbed. To find such order in an abandoned place feels less like disaster and more like decision. It suggests they left not in panic, but with intention. Theories multiply. In the absence of clear answers, some point to climate change, shifts in weather patterns that made the delicate balance of highland agriculture unsustainable. Others speak of disease, but if illness struck, it must have done so without leaving marks in the bones. Still others imagine political fracture, the community splintering into smaller groups that drifted away into the mountains or down into the lowlands. And then there are the more unsettling possibilities. The oral histories of nearby valleys speak in hushed tones of a calling, a season when the sky people turned inward, abandoning their outer terraces and gathering in the high sanctuaries where no outsider could follow. Whether this was a spiritual migration, a collective retreat, or something stranger is left to the listener's imagination. The stories always end the same way: the people ascend into cloud or shadow, and no one ever sees them again. What makes the calling tales compelling is how they echo in the physical evidence. Above the main clusters of ruins, in places far harder to reach, there are hints of even more remote structures, small platforms, walls and cairns perched on ridges that seem almost inaccessible. They are too few to have housed the entire population, but perhaps they served as the first stage in a journey even deeper into the mountains. It is here that the mind begins to wander into the space between history and myth. You imagine the last night in the lower terraces, fires burning low, tools laid neatly aside, possessions chosen and packed. Perhaps they waited for a particular alignment of moon and stars, some celestial marker that told them it was time. At dawn, they set out along the narrow switchbacks, their footsteps quiet against the stone, their cloaks stirring in the mountain wind. From there the trail fades, not in the physical sense, but in the human one. No written record picks up their path. No artifacts matching their craft appear elsewhere. Even the lowland accounts grow vague, shifting from memory to rumor. It is as though they stepped off the edge of the known world. Some modern researchers have likened it to the roaming villages of certain nomadic peoples who would dismantle and move entire settlements when resources waned. But this does not quite fit. The highland terraces were not dismantled, the water channels were left intact. The granaries were left stocked. It is as if they intended to return, but never did. And so the vanishing point is less an event than a slow, steady fading, a light dimming until it can no longer be seen, though it may still be burning somewhere out of sight. This is what makes the mystery so potent, the possibility that they are not entirely gone, only beyond our reach. Standing on the ridge where the terraces give way to raw rock, you can feel the shift. Behind you lies the world they built, orderly and enduring. Ahead, the slope rises into a tangle of ridges and glaciers, a wilderness so unforgiving that even modern climbers hesitate to enter without preparation. Somewhere beyond that line, the last traceable step was taken. Somewhere beyond that line, the thread vanished into cloud. The wind up here has a different voice, thinner, sharper, almost insistent. It rushes through the gullies and over the stones as though trying to speak, a warning or an invitation. You wonder what it must have sounded like on the day the last of them walked into it, not knowing, perhaps, that they were stepping out of history, and if they did know, perhaps that was the point. Beneath the stone terraces and wind-scoured walls, the mountains hold a second world. It is not a place of sky and horizon, but of darkness and closeness, of chambers hidden from the sun, where the air is cool and still, and the past lingers like a scent. Some are narrow cracks in the rock, disguised by shrubs and the slow drift of fallen stones. Others lie at the back of ruined buildings, doorways so small you must stoop or crawl to pass through. Once inside, the sound of the outside world disappears almost instantly. The wind that ruled the high slopes is gone, replaced by a deep, patient silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. In these caves and chambers, archaeologists have found some of the most perplexing evidence of the vanished people. Deep in the dark, far from the terraces where they grew their food and the courtyards where they gathered, lie objects of beauty and care, carved masks with exaggerated features, their eye holes wide and unblinking. Musical instruments, shaped from bone and wood, still faintly smelling of resin, small bowls coated in pigments that retain their color despite the centuries. Why bring such things underground? One theory suggests these were ceremonial spaces, places for rites that demanded privacy, where the presence of the outside world would break the spell. The acoustics of certain chambers support this idea. A single hum or drumbeat can roll along the walls for seconds, swelling into something larger than the sound that made it. It is easy to imagine gatherings, lit by oil lamps, shadows, dancing across the walls, while voices chanted in a language now lost. Another theory is more practical, that these were storerooms designed to preserve valuables against the elements. The caves maintain a steady temperature year-round, and the thick rock shields against snow, rain, and wind. Food could have been kept here in woven baskets, tools stacked neatly in alcoves, and yet, many of the items found seem to serve no strictly practical purpose. They are expressions of identity and art, things meant to be seen, touched, admired. Some researchers have wondered if these spaces served both functions, sanctuary and storage, sacred and everyday. In a culture so tied to the cycles of nature, there may have been little division between the functional and the spiritual. A carved mask could be a ceremonial object, but also a record of a family's lineage. A bowl painted in spirals could be an offering one season and a tool the next. One chamber in particular defies easy explanation. It lies more than 100 meters inside the mountain, reachable only by crawling through a long twisting passage. At its center stands a stone pillar, carved in spirals from base to top. Around it, the floor is littered with small stones painted white, as if each were placed there by hand. There is no sign of water flow or natural collapse that could have caused the arrangement. Whatever its meaning, it was deliberate. And then there are the metals. Fragments of worked copper and a darker, unidentified alloy have been recovered from these underground spaces. Some are tools, chisels, blades, but others are purely decorative. Thin sheets etched with geometric designs, bracelets hammered to a smooth sheen. The alloy, in particular, has raised questions. Its composition does not match known sources in the region, suggesting trade with lands far beyond the valleys. That such items ended up in hidden chambers hints at their value or perhaps their danger. Not all underground spaces are natural. Some appear to have been carved directly into the rock, their walls smoothed and lined with fitted stones. Narrow ledges run along the sides, just wide enough for a person to sit or place objects. In these man-made spaces, soot marks on the ceiling reveal the use of fire for light, evidence of gatherings, perhaps, or nights spent sheltering from storms. In one such carved chamber, a discovery was made that has unsettled more than a few visitors. a series of handprints pressed into the wall, preserved in a thin layer of hardened clay. They are not the frantic marks of someone trying to escape. They are orderly, deliberate, aligned in rows. The hands are of varying sizes, some small enough to belong to children. Whether they are signatures, blessings, or something else, no one can say. But standing there in the beam of a lantern, it is impossible not to feel watched. The deeper one goes, the more the mountain seems to close in. The air grows heavier, the darkness thicker, until even the sound of your own breath feels muted. And yet, in these depths, the vanished people feel strangely close, closer than in the open terraces or the sunlit ruins. Perhaps because here, their presence was not eroded by wind or scattered by snow. The objects, the carvings, the arrangements of stone, they remain almost as they were left, their meanings intact, though their language has been lost. Some believe the final chapter of this civilization is hidden in such spaces. If they knew they were leaving, whether by choice or necessity, perhaps they sealed their most important records deep within the mountains, trusting that the stone would guard them until the time was right to return. Others think these chambers were simply part of their everyday world, as natural to them as fields or rivers, and that we give them mystery only because we cannot imagine living this way. Either way, the earth beneath the terraces holds as many questions as the sky above them. The mountains are layered not just in rock and ice, but in human intention, choices buried so deeply they may never be unearthed. When you emerge from the last chamber into the pale daylight, the wind feels sharper, louder, the open world feels bigger than before, almost overwhelming after the compressed quiet of the caves. But the memory of that stillness clings to you, a reminder that the mountain's story is not only written on their peaks and slopes, but also in their hidden veins, and somewhere in those veins perhaps, the vanished people are still speaking, if only we could hear them. They appear rarely, scattered like whispers across the ruins and hidden chambers. Sometimes they are carved into the lintels of doorways, other times etched onto flat stones left in the open air. A few are painted in faint pigments on plastered walls, their colors dulled, but not erased by time. Each is small enough to be overlooked by a hurried eye, but once you notice them, they begin to appear everywhere, like a quiet pattern revealing itself in the background of a dream. The symbols are not pictorial in the way some ancient scripts are. They do not depict people, animals, or clear objects. Instead, they are made of lines and curves, geometric, almost abstract. A spiral that tightens in perfect proportion. A pair of parallel lines, crossed by smaller strokes at exact intervals. A triangle, enclosed by a circle, the edges softened as though smoothed by a fingertip. Scholars have catalogued dozens of these shapes, noting their repetition across different sites. Some occur often, others only once or twice, but their meaning remains elusive. No bilingual inscription has been found, no Rosetta Stone to bridge their world and ours. Without that key, interpretation becomes a slow dance of speculation, pattern recognition, and the willingness to live with uncertainty. In one theory, the symbols are purely practical, a kind of wayfinding or ownership mark, indicating which clan or family built a particular structure or tended a certain field. In another, they are astronomical notations, mapping the movement of sun, moon, and stars across the seasons. There is also the possibility that they are ceremonial, meant less to be read in the way we read writing and more to be experienced as part of a ritual, visual cues that triggered memory and meaning for those who understood them. The most intriguing aspect is their placement. A symbol carved into the doorway, lintel of a dwelling, might also appear in the deepest part of an underground chamber. Another, etched into a stone in the open courtyard, may be mirrored in miniature on a ceramic bowl. It is as if the same vocabulary was being used in multiple contexts, its meaning shifting slightly depending on where it was placed and who was meant to see it. Some researchers have gone so far as to try to reproduce the symbols by hand, noting how each line flows from another, how the motion of carving or painting might have felt. They speak of the breath rhythm of the symbols, the way certain shapes seem to echo the pace of breathing, as if designed to be drawn in a single exhale. Others notice that the spirals and intersecting lines match natural patterns, the curve of a ram's horn, the branching of alpine streams, the arcs of constellations overhead. This is where the act of decoding turns inward. To try to understand these marks is to try to stand in the mind of someone who looked at the world differently. You begin to imagine a time when writing, if it can even be called that, was not separate from art, from movement, from the physical act of being in the landscape. A time when to carve a spiral into stone was not just to leave a message, but to perform a small act of alignment between self, mountain, and sky. One particular symbol has become something of an obsession for those who study this culture. It is simple, 3 lines radiating from a single point, like the spokes of a wheel that is missing the rest of its rim. It appears on pottery, on wall plaster, on the underside of flat stones used as thresholds. Some believe it represents the mountain itself, with 3 main passes leading away from it. Others think it could symbolize the cycle of seasons, or even a philosophical idea, the meeting point of paths, the convergence of life's directions into one. The temptation is to settle on a meaning, to declare the riddle solved, but each interpretation seems to close more doors than it opens. For every theory, there is another artifact that contradicts it, another symbol placement that doesn't fit, and so the conversation remains open-ended, a long, slow turning of possibilities. In the evenings, when the light fades and the wind grows cooler, the symbols take on a different presence. In the slanting glow of the sun's last hour, the grooves in the stone deepen into shadow. The shapes seem to move, not in the literal sense, but in the way they begin to feel alive, as if the lines themselves remember something, even if they will not tell you what it is. Perhaps that is the final truth of this language, that it was never meant to be separated from the place it belongs to, removed from the terraces, the courtyards, and the cold thin air. The marks are only half themselves. Here in the mountains, they still hum faintly with the meaning their makers gave them. Elsewhere, they might be silent forever, and so you trace one with your fingertip, feeling the slight dip of the groove in the stone. The mountain wind stirs, and for just a moment, you almost believe you hear a word too soft to catch, too fleeting to hold. Then it is gone, leaving only the spiral, the triangle, the parallel lines, and the quiet, endless question of what they were trying to say. The mountains have always had their own language, older than any carved spiral or painted mark. It is spoken, not in words, but in wind, snow, stone, and water. A conversation that has been going on for millions of years, indifferent to whether anyone listens. Up here, the wind is the first voice you hear. It arrives without warning, spilling over ridges and down narrow gullies, sometimes a soft breath, sometimes a roar that rattles loose stones from the cliffs. On certain days, it moves in long, steady streams, as if the entire sky is flowing past you. On others, it comes in sudden, unpredictable gusts, making you lean into it, like a stubborn opponent. This wind has shaped everything. The slopes, the trees clinging to them, even the lines worn into the terraces. Then there is the snow. It does not simply fall, it arrives like a slow occupation, layer upon layer, blanketing every surface until the entire world is remade in white. For the people who lived here, snow was both lifeblood and danger. Its spring melt fed the irrigation channels, swelling them into silver threads that wound through the fields. But too much snow, especially if it came early or stayed too long, could smother crops, close the passes, and trap whole communities for months. A single heavy season could change the fate of an entire year. The snow's companion is ice. Not just the fragile crust on a morning puddle, but ancient ice, glaciers, pale and heavy, pressing slowly down through the valleys. From a distance, they look still, but they are always moving, a pace so slow it becomes invisible to the human eye. Over centuries, they carve deep basins and jagged ridges, altering the land in ways no person could undo. In the warmer months, water takes on a different voice. Streams rush down from the high melt, their sound constant and intricate, 1,000 small impacts of water on stone. These streams feed the terraces, shape the soil, and cut new paths with each season. For the vanished people, controlling water would have been a constant, careful task. Too little, and the crops would fail. Too much, and the terraces could collapse under their own weight. Storms are the mountain's most dramatic speech. Clouds can gather in minutes, spilling over peaks like great tumbling oceans. Lightning cracks across ridges, its sound delayed by the distance, and then the rain arrives in sheets so dense the world beyond a few steps disappears. To live here was to know that a calm day could turn into a trial without warning, and that survival depended on reading the smallest signs, the tilt of the wind, the sudden silence of birds, the scent of rain before it fell. But the mountains also have a slower, subtler rhythm. The seasons here are not just 4 quarters of a year, they are a full cycle of mood and motion. Spring is brief, a rush of color and growth before the heat of summer. Autumn is longer, more deliberate, a gradual retreat of life into seeds, roots, and shelters. Winter is the true ruler, holding the land in its grip for months at a time, reshaping not only the land but the people who endure it. It is in these rhythms that the mystery of the vanished civilization becomes even more layered. Did a shift in this ancient cycle, perhaps a decade of harsher winters or shorter summers, push the balance beyond what even their skill could sustain? Or did the people read the mountains differently, see in the changing patterns, not a threat, but a sign that their time here was ending, that they should move on before the land itself told them to leave? The wind stirs again, lifting fine grains of snow from the higher slopes, carrying them into the air where they glitter briefly before vanishing into cloud. You watch the movement, and it is impossible not to think of the people themselves, how they too may have been carried away, scattered, and dissolved into the greater sweep of the mountain's own history. In the end, the land does not keep our stories for us. It keeps only what it chooses: stone walls that blend into ridges, symbols that fade to the color of lichen, paths that erode until they are indistinguishable from the natural lines of the slope. The rest, it gives back to the wind, the snow, and the long, slow turn of the seasons. And perhaps that is why the mystery endures, because here, in the language of mountains, absence is just another word for transformation. Not everyone who came to these mountains belonged to them. From time to time, rare enough that the lowlands remembered each instance for generations, strangers climbed into the high world, driven by trade, curiosity, or necessity. Most turned back, long before reaching the heart of the terraces. A few made it far enough to see the highlanders themselves. Fewer still lived to tell the tale. The earliest such accounts come not from scholars or soldiers, but from traders. In distant valleys, markets would open each summer to goods that could only have come from the high slopes. Dense wool dyed in deep, improbable blues, salt so pure it glimmered in the sun, obsidian blades so sharp they could split a hair. The traders who brought these wares often spoke little of their journey, answering questions with a shrug or a proverb, but sometimes, over a drink, or at the close of a long night, they would let something slip. A description of narrow stone paths suspended over drops so sheer, the clouds below looked like lakes. The scent of burning resin that clung to their clothes long after they left, the strange silence of entire days without bird call or insect hum. From these fragments, a picture began to form, a place apart, where daily life ran on a rhythm different from anywhere else. The Highlanders, they said, moved with deliberate calm, as though time itself slowed in the thin air. They spoke a language that rolled like water over stone, its syllables soft and unhurried, and their eyes, always their eyes, were described as bright and clear, reflecting the sky's pale blue, even in shadow. There are also accounts from emissaries sent by rulers in the lowlands, hoping to open diplomatic ties. Most returned with polite refusals or vague promises. One, however, came back with a story so strange that it was dismissed as embellishment until similar details appeared in later testimonies. He claimed he was led into a vast courtyard at dawn, where the Highlanders gathered without speaking as the sun's first light spilled over the mountains. The people stood perfectly still, facing east, until the sunlight reached a particular stone in the center of the courtyard. Then, as if on cue, they dispersed without a word, returning to their tasks, as though nothing unusual had happened. Centuries later, an itinerant monk recorded an even more unsettling encounter. While seeking solitude in the high passes, he stumbled upon a narrow terrace where a group of figures stood watching him. They were dressed in layered cloaks that shifted like the feathers of birds when the wind touched them. None spoke, but after a moment, one stepped forward and offered him a small bundle of dried flowers. He accepted, but when he looked up from examining them, the figures were gone, vanished without a sound, though there was nowhere to hide. He never saw them again, but kept the flowers until his death, claiming they had never withered. Travelers' accounts are never entirely free from the coloring of fear and wonder. Some speak of hospitality, warm food, a bed of woven mats, careful gestures of welcome. Others tell of watchfulness, of being accompanied at a distance by silent figures until they left the territory. A few describe being turned back without explanation, led to the edge of a ridge, and pointed firmly toward the valleys below. The reliability of these stories is difficult to measure. Details shift from teller to teller, dates blur, and distances are exaggerated. Yet certain elements repeat so often they take on the weight of likelihood: the precision of the terraces, the presence of carved symbols, the deliberate way the people moved through their space, and the sense that the mountains themselves formed an invisible boundary between those who belonged and those who did not. One of the most curious patterns is the way these encounters seem to taper off in the historical record, as if the Highlanders were gradually closing themselves off from the outside world. The traders who once appeared every summer came less often, then stopped altogether. Emissaries returned empty-handed. Travelers who set out for the high slopes simply did not return. It was as though the civilization was drawing inward, retreating into the hidden folds of the mountains. There are even stories of deliberate concealment. In one valley, elders tell of a time when the Highlanders blocked the lower entrances to their paths with rockfalls, not to trap enemies, but to erase the routes entirely. These rockfalls, they say, were made to look natural, blending so perfectly with the surrounding slopes that even those who had once used the paths could no longer find them. If true, it suggests an extraordinary act of self-isolation, one that would have made their eventual disappearance all but inevitable. For outsiders, the highlands were a place of contradiction, beautiful yet forbidding, welcoming in moments but quick to push back against intrusion, and perhaps that was the point. By controlling who could see their world, the Highlanders could control their own fate, until something, whether from within or beyond, changed the balance. What remains from these rare encounters is not enough to give us answers, but it does give us a feeling, the sense of being close to something profound, only to watch it recede again into mist. The stories are like distant campfires glimpsed across a valley, real but unreachable. Even now, when you stand on a ridge and look toward the terraces, you can almost imagine what those strangers felt: the slow tightening in the chest, the way the air grows still, the subtle awareness of being seen. And perhaps, somewhere in the folds of the peaks, unseen eyes still watch from behind stone and shadow, deciding whether the world below is ready to know what happened here. History is not as solid as we imagine. Even the grandest civilizations, those with cities that glittered in the sun, armies that spanned continents, and rulers whose names were carved in stone, can dissolve into silence. The mountain's mystery is striking, yes, but it is not alone. Across the world, the past is filled with places where the thread was cut, leaving behind questions no one can quite answer. The ancestral pueblones of the American Southwest, left behind cliff dwellings that cling to rock faces like swallows' nests, their rooms still marked by soot from ancient fires. Around the late 13th century, they abandoned these homes. Drought is one explanation. Social upheaval is another. But the truth is a web of environmental and cultural changes, too complex to untangle fully. In the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa were marvels of urban planning, straight streets, sophisticated drainage, standardized weights. Then, around 1900 BCE, they declined. Climate shifts, changing rivers, and the slow erosion of trade networks have been offered as causes. Yet the collapse happened quietly, without evidence of massive invasion or fire. It is a silence much like the one in the mountains, a vanishing that feels almost voluntary. Farther east, the Khmer Empire's great city of Angkor rose from the forests of Cambodia, its temples reflecting both power and deep spiritual belief. Yet, in the 15th century, much of it was abandoned. The jungle crept back in. Theories range from climate swings to shifting trade routes, but even now, the reason for Angkor's transformation remains contested. There is a rhythm to these disappearances, a slow withdrawal rather than a sudden fall. It's a rhythm that feels familiar when we think of the highland civilization. No burned villages, no scattered skeletons, just a fading of presence, a gradual loosening of their hold on the land until nothing remains but the structures that once held their lives. But not all vanishings are so gentle. The Mayan collapse in the 9th century CE shows another path, a combination of drought, war, and political fragmentation, leading to the abandonment of great city centers. Here the end was written in layers of conflict and stress, the ruins bearing the marks of a society straining under multiple pressures. The highland people, in contrast, seem to have escaped such visible fractures, as if their departure was a choice made before the fabric began to tear. These comparisons matter because they remind us that disappearance is not always the same as destruction. A people may leave without dying out, carrying their culture elsewhere, transforming it until it no longer looks like the thing it once was. And sometimes, what vanishes in one place survives in another, hidden in language, in ritual, in the way fields are sown or houses are built. Could this be the case with the mountain dwellers? If they moved on, whether to other highlands or into the lowlands, they may have folded into existing communities, their ways becoming invisible within a generation or two. Oral histories could have preserved fragments of their identity even as their name was lost. Archaeologists searching for them might walk past their descendants without ever knowing it. There's also the possibility that their retreat was deliberate and complete, an intentional cutting of ties with the wider world. The idea is not without precedent. The Sentinel people of the Andaman Islands have resisted contact for centuries, living in isolation despite the world's awareness of them. Other groups, such as the Kalash in northern Pakistan, maintain unique traditions in the face of surrounding cultures. Isolation can be both shield and prison, a way of preserving identity that eventually turns into a narrowing of options. And sometimes, nature itself decides the matter. The Greenland Norse settlements, founded in the late 10th century, endured for centuries in a harsh climate, but a combination of cooling temperatures, soil depletion, and reduced trade eventually pushed them to the edge. By the 15th century, the settlements were gone, their churches and farmhouses left to the wind. The parallels to the mountain terraces are easy to imagine, a slow tightening of the seasons, the land offering less and less until departure became the only choice. Looking across these examples, patterns emerge. Civilizations vanish when their environment changes faster than they can adapt. They vanish when trade or communication lines break. They vanish when internal tensions erode cohesion, or when a deliberate choice is made to withdraw. Sometimes, it is one of these causes. More often, it is all of them, intertwined in ways no single theory can capture. And yet, the mountain people resist easy classification. They left behind a landscape that feels cared for, not collapsed, a place still in balance, at least on the surface. This is the detail that continues to puzzle researchers and to fascinate us. It hints at a kind of agency, a final act of self-determination. Whatever happened, they were not simply swept away by forces beyond their control. This wider lens also reminds us that vanishing is part of a larger cycle. Societies grow, adapt, fragment, and sometimes dissolve, leaving their traces for the future to puzzle over. The highland terraces, like the stone temples of Angkor or the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, are not failures. They are the remnants of lives lived fully in a particular place, for as long as conditions allowed. When those conditions changed, the people changed with them, even if it meant leaving the place they had shaped for generations. And perhaps that is why the mystery of the mountains feels so alive. It is both singular and universal. Singular, because the details of their life and departure are unique to this landscape and these people. Universal, because disappearance is woven into the story of humanity itself. The mountains, silent as they are, have seen this before. They have watched people come and go, leaving behind only enough for the imagination to rebuild what was lost, and they will likely watch it happen again. Theories about the disappearance of the mountain people have a way of multiplying like tributaries, branching from a single stream. Each begins with a solid foothold in the evidence, then twists into speculation where the record runs out. You follow one, thinking you've found the truth, only to arrive at a sheer cliff, turn back, and another path opens. The first and perhaps most widely discussed is climate change. The mountains are a delicate balance of temperature, snowfall, and meltwater. A few years of harsher winters, or delayed thaws, could shrink growing seasons beyond what even the most skilled terrace farmers could handle. Pollen samples taken from soil cores near the ruins show shifts in vegetation over time, plants that thrive in warmer conditions, giving way to those suited to cold. This could point to a cooling period, perhaps a localized effect of broader climate patterns. Yet the terraces remain intact, the channels unbroken. If the climate forced them to leave, why does the land not bear more scars of desperation? A second path leads to resource depletion. Life at altitude depends not only on soil and water, but on fuel, game and materials for shelter. Over generations, the slow stripping of nearby forests for firewood could have pushed the tree line lower, forcing longer journeys for fuel. Hunting grounds may have been overused, herds of mountain goats and deer moving elsewhere. This is a theory that fits the slow fade, people leaving in small groups to settle in more forgiving lands. But it also raises a counterpoint. These people had lived here for centuries. Why would a balance they maintained for so long suddenly collapse? Then there is the possibility of disease. Epidemics can erase entire communities in a matter of seasons, especially in isolated regions where immune systems are unprepared for new pathogens. The trouble is, disease often leaves physical traces, in bones, in DNA, in hurried burials. Here, there is no such evidence. If an illness swept through, it left the dead as invisible as the living who followed them. The political fracture theory suggests that the disappearance was not a single event, but the unraveling of a social fabric. A loss of leadership, disputes over resources, or rival clans pulling away from one another could have fragmented the population. Over time, small splinters would move apart, their identities blending with other highland or lowland groups until the original culture dissolved entirely. It is a neat theory for explaining how the people themselves might survive, even if the civilization did not. But the absence of transitional sites, places where their architecture or artifacts mingle with those of neighbors, remains a sticking point. A more enigmatic path points to spiritual migration. Some researchers take seriously the calling stories found in local folklore, that the people left to follow a sign from the gods or to reach a prophesied place. In this scenario, their departure would have been voluntary, even celebrated. They might have moved to higher, more remote sanctuaries, still undiscovered, or to a symbolic location outside the mountains entirely. The trouble here is that without written records or living descendants to confirm it, the line between belief and reality is hard to draw. And then there is the catastrophic event hypothesis, a sudden avalanche, earthquake, or rockfall that sealed the highland community off from the outside world, forcing survivors to leave quickly. The mountains are capable of violence, and there are signs of seismic activity in the region's past. Yet the ruins show no widespread collapse, and such an event would likely have left more obvious traces in the surrounding slopes. Some theories blend into one another, forming combinations that feel more plausible than any single cause. A minor climate shift could have strained resources, leading to political rifts. A disease could have arrived at a moment when supplies were already thin, tipping the balance from survival to departure. In this sense, the disappearance may have been less a mystery than the natural outcome of multiple pressures converging. Still, one idea refuses to fade from the conversation: that the people chose to vanish, not out of necessity, but out of intent. The blocked mountain paths, the careful state of the terraces, the absence of chaotic abandonment, all hint at a decision made on their own terms. It is a theory that both frustrates and fascinates historians, because it shifts the story from tragedy to agency. What could drive an entire community to step away from the life they had built for generations? Some imagine a collective pact, agreed upon over months or years. Perhaps the Highland world was never meant to be permanent, only a chapter in a longer journey. In this light, their disappearance was not an ending, but a continuation elsewhere. Others think of it as a protective measure taken to preserve their way of life from a change they saw coming, whether that was war, disease, or the slow pull of the outside world. And yet, no matter which path you follow, you always arrive at the same obstacle: absence. The record ends. The thread is gone. Without the voices of the Highlanders themselves, each theory remains an echo, clear enough to recognize as a voice, but too faint to make out the words. In the end, these theories are not just explanations, they are mirrors for our own ideas about what matters most in survival: adaptation, endurance, faith, or the choice to leave while the world still feels whole. Each possibility casts the Highlanders in a different light: victims, innovators, pilgrims, or guardians of a secret too large to share. And perhaps that is why the mystery continues to hold us. The mountain paths split and twist, and we walk each one in turn, never reaching the summit, always turning back to try another. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the truth waits, as patient as the stone, as silent as the wind. Long after the Highlanders' voices faded, the mountains kept speaking in their own quiet ways. Not in language we can translate, but in shapes, colors, and textures that change with the light. It is a memory without words, steady, unbroken, and beyond the reach of forgetting. The terraces still hold their form, even when left untended for centuries. In summer, they green over with alpine grasses and small wildflowers, a soft echo of the crops that once swayed here. In winter, they vanish under snowdrifts, becoming white steps climbing toward the peaks. Year after year, the same slow transformation plays out, the land moving through its cycles as though the people had never left. The water channels, too, remain. After heavy snowmelt, you can trace their lines by the glint of water moving in thin ribbons down the slopes. Some carry enough flow to feed small stands of willow and birch trees that were never part of the Highlanders' world, but now grow where their hands once guided the water. Others run dry, except in the briefest weeks of spring, their stones warm in the afternoon sun, holding the memory of streams long gone. Stone walls lean but do not fall. The frost has pried at their edges, the roots of hardy shrubs have crept between their seams, yet they still stand defiant in the thin air. Lichen has painted them in slow-moving constellations of green, yellow, and silver. In places, the stones seem to hum faintly when the wind moves through narrow gaps, a sound too subtle to notice unless you stop walking and listen. Higher up, where the air sharpens and the vegetation thins, the land takes on an emptiness that feels intentional, as if the mountain is holding space for what once was. Here the ground is bare rock, smoothed by ice ages and carved by streams that no longer flow. In the distance, glaciers cling to the shaded faces of peaks, their edges receding a little more each decade. These frozen masses hold ancient water, perhaps older than the Highlanders themselves, locked away in crystal until the slow heat of time releases it. It is in these quiet details, the arc of a terrace wall, the trickle of water through a forgotten channel, that the mountain's memory lives. Not as a record we can read, but as a rhythm we can feel. The same sun that warmed their mornings still rises here. The same moon that lit their night journeys still hangs over the ridges. The same storms roll down the valleys, carving paths through snow and stone. Sometimes it is easy to forget that the land does not remember us the way we remember it. We attach meaning to its shapes, weave stories into its slopes, and read symbols into the arrangement of stones. But to the mountain, all lives, human or otherwise, are part of a single, unbroken flow. It does not distinguish between the Highlander's footsteps and the hoofprints of a passing ibex, between the wind rattling through a ruin and the wind moving through an untouched cliffside. And yet, the endurance of their work has left a subtle mark. Terraces hold more than soil. They hold the idea that the mountain can be shaped gently and with respect. The water channels hold more than water. They hold the memory of hands guiding its course. The stone walls hold more than weight. They hold the patience of those who built without haste, who placed each stone as if it might stand forever. Standing in the middle of a terrace now, you feel the scale of both presences, the people who once worked this ground and the mountain that allowed it. Neither is fully gone. The mountain's memory is not in the details of their lives, but in the shapes they left behind, the way the land still carries traces of their will. It is this quiet persistence that makes the disappearance feel less like an erasure and more like a transformation. The Highlanders may no longer walk here, but the mountain has kept their outline, holding it steady against the slow erosion of time, and in that outline, perhaps lies the beginning of an answer, not to why they left, but to why their absence still matters. Sometimes, when the morning mist lies low over the terraces, the stones seem to shift, not in the way a landslide moves, but in the way a reflection ripples in disturbed water, subtle, almost imagined. In that wavering moment, it is easy to believe the Highlanders are still here, walking the narrow paths between walls, carrying baskets of grain, speaking to one another in the rhythm of the wind. This is the place where fact and myth are no longer strangers. Every piece of evidence, every fragment of pottery, every carved symbol, sits alongside stories told by people who have never climbed to these heights. And both, in their own way, are true. The archaeologists describe the terraces, the irrigation channels, the underground chambers. They speak in the language of measurements and dates, of pollen analysis and radiocarbon samples. The storytellers speak of the sky people, of the morning gatherings when the sun touched the central stone, of the night the Highlanders walked into the mist and were never seen again. Somewhere between those two languages lies the fuller shape of the truth. Perhaps the myths remember what the science cannot measure, a reason, a choice, a vow made in a season of change. And perhaps the science reveals what the myths have polished into metaphor, how the land shifted, how the climate pressed, how the people adapted until adaptation was no longer enough. One story from the lowlands tells of a footprint found high in the snow, long after the people had gone. It was pressed deep, the shape of it unmistakably human, yet there was only one, no trail leading to it, no matching step nearby. The storyteller swears the snow was fresh that day, the sky clear, the air so still you could hear ice cracking in the distance. In their telling, the footprint was not left by a person walking, but by someone stepping from the earth into the air itself, vanishing upward into the clouds. It is an image that stays with you as you move through the ruins, the idea that departure does not always mean decline, that some vanishings are ascents. The Highlanders may not have been carried bodily into the sky, but perhaps their leaving was a kind of rising toward some place they had been waiting for, toward an idea of home we cannot see from here. On certain days, when the sun is low and the wind carries the scent of melting snow, you might notice the play of light across the stones. Shadows fall in such a way that the terraces look like the rungs of an immense ladder, climbing into the haze where the mountains meet the clouds. The thought comes unbidden, if the people had to go, perhaps this was the way they went, not along a road of earth, but along the steps of air and light their own hands had built. There is another story, one without words, carried only in the way the land feels beneath you. It says that leaving is sometimes the only way to preserve what you are. Stay too long, and the world changes you until you are no longer yourself. Go, and you may carry the heart of your world with you intact. The Highlanders may have chosen the latter path, sealing their terraces, tending their last fires, and then walking beyond sight, not in fear, but in resolve. The mountains themselves seem to keep this choice alive. Clouds gather often along the high ridges, swirling like slow rivers, stand still long enough, and you may see shapes within them. Shoulders bent beneath a woven cloak, a hand lifted in greeting or warning, a line of figures threading their way along a path that fades even as you watch. The rational mind dismisses it as a trick of light and vapor. But here in the thin air, where breath comes hard and thoughts move differently, rationality feels smaller, less certain. Perhaps this is why the story of the Highlanders resists closure. In the lowlands, history demands conclusions: the fall of a city, the death of a king, the signing of a treaty. Up here, the end of a story can be a beginning, and a disappearance can be a form of survival. To walk into the clouds is not to be lost, it is to be in a place the rest of the world cannot follow. And so, as you stand on the last terrace and look out over the ridges, you feel less like an investigator and more like a witness. Not to their lives, which ended before you arrived, but to the space they have left, a space that still holds their outline, as if waiting for them to step back into it. The wind picks up, carrying with it a fine mist from the peaks above. You close your eyes, and for a moment you hear something almost like footsteps, almost like voices. But when you open them, there is only the terrace, the stone walls, and the long slow drift of the clouds wrapping themselves around the mountain's shoulders. Maybe the Highlanders are gone forever. Maybe they are here, just beyond the veil of our senses. Maybe both are true. The terraces end. The last stone wall fades into grass, and the path begins to dissolve into the mountain's raw slope. Beyond this point, there are no more traces, not of their hands, not of their homes, not of their footsteps. It is as if the Highlanders have slipped entirely out of reach. You pause here, not because there is anything to see, but because you feel the weight of the absence. It is not a crushing weight, but a quiet one, like the pause between heartbeats. All along the journey, we have searched for them, in stone and soil, in story and sky. Yet now, we stand at the edge of the unknowable. Perhaps this is where the real meaning of their disappearance begins to take shape, not as a puzzle to solve, but as a reflection to carry. Civilizations vanish, yes, but so do families, traditions, languages, and the smallest rituals of everyday life. Every life leaves traces, and every trace fades in time. What happened here, in these high places, is only the most dramatic version of something that happens everywhere. It's easy to think of loss as a void, but maybe it is something else, a change in form. The Highlanders may no longer walk their terraces, but their presence has seeped into the mountain itself, in the way the walls still hold, in the way water still finds the channels they shaped, in the way the wind feels different when it moves through these stones. The people are gone, but their work remains part of the land's own body, and what of us, who stand here centuries later, trying to imagine their faces? We too will leave behind landscapes, some of stone, some of memory. One day, others may look at what we have made, and wonder why we stopped, why we left, why our footprints ended where they did. They may walk among our remnants, and try to guess our stories, and perhaps they will find themselves asking the same question we ask now. Did they go willingly, or were they taken by something they could not resist? In that sense, the Highlanders are not far from us at all. Their vanishing lives inside the human pattern, the tension between holding on and letting go, between staying and moving on. They remind us that survival is not always about staying rooted. Sometimes it is about knowing when to walk away, even if no one will ever know where you went. The mystery endures not because it hides the truth, but because it speaks to something deeper than the truth. The Highlanders show us that it is possible to disappear without collapsing, to leave without destroying, to step into the unknown and let the world wonder. As you turn to leave the terraces behind, the wind follows for a while, brushing against your back like a quiet farewell. The clouds have lowered, curling around the ridges until the peaks are gone from view. The path downward feels different now, not because the stones have changed, but because you have. You carry with you not just the shapes of their walls or the sound of the streams, but the idea that vanishing can be its own kind of legacy. At the edge of the last slope, you look back one more time. The terraces are already half hidden by mist. In a few minutes, they will be gone entirely, absorbed into the whiteness, and in that moment, you understand this is exactly how they left, quietly, completely, without leaving enough for the world to follow, only enough for it to remember. Perhaps that is the lesson the Highlanders have left us, that no matter how much we search, there will always be things we cannot know. And perhaps that is not a flaw in the story, but the point of it, because in the end, the most enduring mysteries are the ones we carry inside ourselves.